Hello. So today I'm going to begin the paper by sharing some first-hand accounts from my field research with Mexican migrant seasonal workers involved with the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program in Canada that began in 1974 and had origins in a former program encompassing Caribbean seasonal workers known as the Offshore program, and that began in 1966. Can you hear me? Okay. So my research offers a measure of representation to underrepresented groups working on the margins of Canadian society, but it doesn't presuppose that participants are subaltern or have no sense of agency in their jobs. While the self workers experience precarity, vulnerability, and oftentimes injustice in their jobs, in some cases returning workers reported satisfaction with their jobs or even gratitude for the chance to secure employment, albeit temporary or seasonal. The telling of migrant stories and contributions to Canada's economic life through official discourses from consular officials, provincial and federal policymakers, judicial reasoning, farmer or employer narratives, or journalism may present us with seemingly a comprehensive picture of guest worker lives. But I argue that the more insight we have into experiences of individuals, the better policymakers and public can understand or evaluate the effectiveness and efficiencies of the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program as a whole. Healthier policies for migrants can only then be formed and implemented. By locating and establishing dialogues with the migrant, we can learn from the past and better pretend a future free of injustice. Since I didn't carry out any field work in Mexico, most of my findings about discrepancies and inconsistencies within the SOP program reside in interprovincial differences that came to define and shape migrant workers' experiences, with elements of accommodation changing dramatically by local conditions. So working conditions and accommodation climates changing from one province to another. So I'm going to share some of my oral history findings. This stuff is just kind of complimentary background photos. So one Antonio, these are all pseudonyms. Antonio was riding his bicycle on a Monday evening in late June on his way to his lodging at a greenhouse where he was employed in East Selkirk, Manitoba, where he worked seasonally along with 4 other workers from Mexico. Eager to chat after work, Antonio described his origins. He was originally from Oaxaca. He currently resides in Mexico City with his wife and 3 children. And asked about his opinion on work in Canada, he said the work was good. He wasn't able to easily make new friends among Canadians while in Canada. And in Mexico, he worked mainly as a construction worker. And during his Canadian contract, he was only doing greenhouse labor. His employer could only speak a very small amount of Spanish, and his job involved cultivating a variety of ornamental plants and vegetables, berries, shrubs for the local retail outlet, which marketed to retail outlets throughout the province. This is sort of a greenhouse that develops flowers for Home Depot and that kind of thing. He also was able to engage in a return trip to Mexico midway through his contract, and he arrived to work in February of 2012. And on his free time, he frequented the Extra Foods marketplace in the town center, connected to East Selkirk by a bridge that was commonly used by the migrants in the area. Most of the Canadian residents in the town use cars, and the migrant workers are often forced to use bicycles for transport. It was their most important means of travel to and from the town to their work site. So Antonio is a living example of how Mexicans working seasonally in Canada can exist and subsist on the fringes of Canadian society. A return visit to East Selkirk, oh, that's an ornamental plant that they produce. A return visit to East Selkirk in June 2014 revealed that most temporary work contracts available in the greenhouse are in Bernadero, was limited to 4 months only, February through June, despite the fact that a small number of workers stayed to work in the fall months. However, the majority in this group would return to Mexico at the end of June, and the group performed, since the cold month of February, much of behind-the-scenes labor required to sprout and develop a large selection of greenhouse-grown flowers. About 18 workers shared 3 trailer houses, with 6 residing in each and sharing common kitchens and living rooms. The trailers are equipped with televisions, adjacent sheds to store the workers' bicycles, and in free time was often spent fishing by the river, walking or riding to the town center, etc. Mariano is another worker from Morelos, an indigenous village that produces mainly tomatoes. Also worked at the greenhouse and was a father of 3 children. He had spent 5 seasons as a temporary agricultural worker in Canada and developed quite a bit of experience from his contracts. One of his previous contracts was at a cucumber greenhouse in Leamington. And the greenhouse job, according to Mariano, was preferable to floricultural work in Manitoba because there was more work available, so more hours, a longer contract, better wage in the end, accumulatively. And it was easier for him to access Mexican foods in the town because there was a bigger presence there. Whereas in Selkirk there was just nothing, like not very much. He had also spoken with other workers who had previously worked on tobacco farms in southern Ontario, but didn't have any personal experience with that. And from his conversations with these other workers, he found that the tobacco work involved experiences of high heat in kilns and also heavy use of machinery. According to Mariano, his greenhouse job was good, but the padrones or employers were either Italian or Chinese and weren't as agreeable as the farm owners in Manitoba. The Canadian padrones were nicer in Manitoba compared to those in Ontario. Another worker, who I'm calling Segundo, from the state of Mexico, worked in Canada for a total of 9 years. 2014 was his first experience in Manitoba, and his contract was very short, lasting only 4 months. He also had a wife and children. I'm okay for time? And was looking forward to return to Mexico at the end of June. He also had experience working in Quebec, Ontario, BC. He worked with strawberries in Quebec, apples in British Columbia, and in a greenhouse in Ontario. Another thing just to mention was the workers rarely are given helmets, so they're constantly riding around Selkirk on bicycles without helmets, so it's an issue. Another worker, Carlos, was from southern Veracruz, and he formerly lived in a region that was highly agricultural, that grew a lot of coffee. He also had owned a taxi at home and a small sugarcane field. He ideally would like to desired another work term in Canada in the following year. His impressions of the province of Manitoba, however, were not favorable. He much preferred his time in Quebec, where he had experience working 6 other seasons. In Quebec, there were many more fellow Mexican workers, and his job involved transporting potatoes from a field to a company storehouse in a big truck. He also lived at that time 30 minutes from Montreal in the town of Joliette, so that's where his potato farm was. He had no experience working in the US, but had a lot of family there, including cousins and uncles in the Carolinas, Southern California, Las Vegas, and Texas. And he also commented that in Mexico he's married, but here I'm not. Posing sort of a challenge, indicating a challenge for the guest workers such as Carlos through the social dislocation caused by migration, and basically migrants have been forced to adapt and form horizontal relationships with fellow workers to help mitigate the social deficiencies caused by migration. I'm okay for time? Okay. Manuel, another worker outside Portage la Prairie, was from San Luis Potosi, and he had worked 9 months in Manitoba. Formerly in Mexico, he worked with an orange harvest, and had also performed 7 seasons in Manitoba and 1 in Quebec. Some of his previous bosses gave him many hours of work, but then something changed, and the employer passed away, and his current employer demanded fewer hours and less labor from the group. He also recounted experience as a temporary worker at a tree nursery in Quebec. And in Manitoba, he was preoccupied mainly with an asparagus harvest. The job then transitioned into strawberries, and at the time that I interviewed, he was working in broccoli harvesting. He also said that there was not much nice work in Manitoba, and he had preferred his season in Montreal. He also missed his family, food, and especially his children, but Canada gave him everything he needed to live better, since Mexico offered him few opportunities for good work. So I'm going to argue that despite increased academic and union-based attention to their presence, rural labor in Manitoba continues to suffer from a sort of invisibility. The experience of hired hands is often shrouded in silence, and it couldn't hold truer for farm workers of minority extraction, Aboriginal Canadians, Mexican Mennonites, Mexicans. None have written of their experiences, positive or negative, as farm laborers. In 1978, debates emerged in Manitoba about the ostensible benefits of employing offshore, and it was often farmers who stressed this form of hiring could be a benefit to them. Manitoba farmers in Portage expressed concerns about proposed limitations on the numbers of non-Canadian workers they could hire. As one grower, Ed Connery, suggested, Canada's Employment and Immigration Commission's plan to allow 14 Mexican workers on Portage area farms in 1978 was inadequate to meet the labor demands of his already planned crop production. And a Free Press report from that year depicted the Mexican farm workers as skilled, productive, dependable, setting a good example for local Native and Métis, many of whom hadn't had the opportunity to develop a work habit. Also that year there was an attempted phase out of the Mexican migrant labor in Manitoba, and this was at odds with the needs expressed by farmers who feared pursuing another growing season without their help. There are also discrepancies between what was described as adequate housing conditions, between the woefully inadequate housing conditions of some seasonal Aboriginal workers on a number of sugar beet farms in southern Manitoba, where shacks and old milk trucks served as accommodation. So the issue of constructing housing for seasonal Mexican farm workers was met using either shared trailer accommodations or building dorm-style accommodations on site, which now exist in a number of farms in places like Marquette, Manitoba, which is just west of Winnipeg. 1 minute? Okay. So just a quick focus on BC. I did some field work in Oliver. And unlike Manitoba, Oliver has hosted women workers from Mexico, and they travel to perform seasonal work. One worker I interviewed, Magdalena, which is a fruit picker, and had left behind 4 children at home. Another worker, Gabriela, was a mother of 2 young girls. And so basically these women are putting their children under the care of extended family while they come to work. Another worker from Chiapas, Miguel Angel, admitted his work was difficult in BC, long days of work, sometimes 12 to 14 hours a day. and he was often extremely tired at the end of the workday. He didn't enjoy as much freedom as he had in Mexico compared with Canada, but he said the money was good. Another worker, Pablo, had developed long-standing connections with his host farm, and he had been based seasonally in Oliver for 7 years consecutively at a winery and organic farm. He also lived alongside 8 other workers, and some of the quarters were shared within the room, so they didn't often have their own private room. And I guess I'll just wrap up. So in my final analysis, I'll argue that the Canadian Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program does not enable temporary workers from the Caribbean and Mexico to circulate freely on the Canadian labor market. And as a result, we see this boom in activism and outreach work in terms of lobbying for their rights in a variety of contexts. I also did some historical comparisons with the Bracero era and the United Farm Workers era, and basically I found that no period has been short of activism, revolutionary activity, and mobilization. And so workers aren't necessarily drawing from this past, but it kind of emerges as a natural outgrowth of conditions caused by various unfree labor systems or geographical fixes that have allowed countries like Canada to procure labor from afar to solve a particular problem. So I guess that's it. I'm out of time. Looking forward to more discussion and questions.